about. Please share your knowledge. But also at the same time, to say that sociology. I mean, actually a full blown now sociology of the environment, and like there are environmental sociology programs at some schools, because sociology is sort of uniquely in a position to talk about the relationship of human beings to the environment, and of course, I should say, something along the lines of we only we well, all right, on one level, the environment is a social construction, right? What we perceive of as a healthy natural environment, even though it is to a certain extent clearly beyond our control, our perceptions of it, our relationship to it is a social one, and with all of the problem, I mean, even conceiving of the environment as something that can have problems, that is dependent on, I guess, an idea that human beings have a particular relationship to the environment. We really only care about the environment. Let me advance this here. Okay, we really only care about the environment to the extent that we have a relationship to it. And I would also go so far as to say the environment doesn't care about us. There's an old joke kind of about how obviously we're doing all kinds of things to the earth, but if at a certain point say global warming gets so bad that the human species goes extinct, the earth doesn't care, right? Cockroaches take over. Evolution continues to proceed. The environment doesn't care about you, right? The environment is a neutral factor out there. We care about the environment in particular ways, and we especially care about the environment, in as much as it's important to the quality of human life. Even that concern that you have about the polar bears, it's because you like polar bears, right? It's not necessarily because the polar bear gives a shit about you. And so what? Some basic stuff here, and this really kind of speaks to that point, this idea of ecology. We are doing in one sense a human ecology here. So looking at how human beings interact with the environment that's out there. And obviously we have a significant impact on that environment. You can, as with an illustration like this or a photo like this, I suppose this is, Kansas or Nebraska or someplace good and flat. You can see the impact of human beings on the environment from space, right? We've bent and twisted the earth to our own particular needs, and it's again, I'm resistant to almost any sense of saying there's a natural environment, because all of it goes through a human lens. But in as much as we can talk about the natural environment, it's that stuff that's out there, the atmosphere, the dirt, the resources, the planet itself. And I just want to add a caveat here. So we talk about human ecology in a environmental sociology sense. There is a different sense of human ecology, and if you're going on with environmental studies or urban studies, other things, you'll find that human ecology can be this study of how human beings interact with the natural environment, but also, more specifically, I think, for some areas of sociology and for some sociologists and especially urban studies folks, human ecology can specifically mean how human beings interact spatially. And so that's like, how is a neighborhood constructed? At that point, actually, we're not worrying about the natural environment very much. It's more questions of like, can a poor person move into a rich person's neighborhood, or why do the rich people live up on a hill and the poor people live, down by the power plant or something like that. So similar but different. Now. Why this is a particularly sociological area of study, why environmental sociology has really taken off in the last 20 to 25 years, is that a lot of these, so-called environmental problems are really human-caused problems. Of course, again, I would reiterate, environmental problems are only problems from the human point of view. The planet doesn't care about global warming. There was an asteroid that screwed the dinosaurs, however many millions of years ago. It's just, stuff happens. It's only from the human perspective that we can talk about there being environmental problems. And usually when we're talking about those problems, we're talking about them from either a pragmatic or really an emotive place, a cultural place, from which we say like, oh, I miss when that mountain was pristine and it wasn't covered in rich people's ski chalets, that kind of a thing, right? So that kind of crowded. It's a problem, but only a problem from the human perspective. And of course, many of those problems, right, are caused by human beings. So we say they're anthropogenic, right? Anthropogenic meaning that it is something that has its roots, that has its causes in human activities. So climate change, water pollution, right? And we'll go through each of these sort of in turn. Species extinction. This is the photo from the Camp Fire from a couple of years ago, which was a really unfortunate name. Right? It's not a campfire. It's like named after a town, I guess, called Camp. It was a huge fire that destroyed, thousands of acres in Northern California, which had anthropogenic causes, right? So it was sparked by power lines, but also really the perspective on it being so bad or scary, problematic, was tied to the fact that so many people had built their houses in the middle of woods like this, so you see these houses are right up against these big old pine trees in Northern California, and sorry, the president, has said on a couple of occasions, things would be better if they swept the forest floors. There's not really much truth to that, but there is some truth to the fact that better forest management could make these fires less bad, but people are resistant to things like controlled fires, and controlled fires become very difficult when everybody has their house in the forest already. So really, it's because of human causes, human activities, that these fires get so badly out of hand. So it's really a sociologist's job to talk about, how those causes come into place, what different factors lead people to do things like build their houses in highly fire-prone areas, and then ultimately, ultimately it gets into the public policy arena. Politicians and other interested parties have to figure out, how are we going to deal with it? But sociology can suggest solutions. Again, it's probably not things like sweeping the forest, but we can look across societies to people who have done more or less successful things to avoid things like, very deadly forest fires, right? We can suggest different policies here. So the Earth, right? Again, this is kind of at the more abstract level, but we should note that the Earth is a single ecosystem, right? Meaning that that the different elements of it interact with one another. The living things interact with the non-living, the non-biological stuff, the weather, the dirt, etc. And also, though, I forget whose metaphor was spaceship Earth, right? It's like we're all on this ship that's hurtling through space, right? And all the supplies that we have, all of the experiences we can have are tied to that spaceship, if you will. But more importantly, maybe, is the fact that anything we screw with at any particular level, with the spaceship, has effects elsewhere, right? It is a single system ultimately. So you think about like some things are more or less bounded systems. If you pour a bunch of chemicals into a particular lake, then you're screwing over that particular lake. But things like global warming, climate change, really happen at a global level, or and have global effects, right? And things like, I guess there's some lake up here in Africa, right, that dried out, in part because of global warming, and then the winds blew the sand into the Atlantic, and now we have these giant sargassum mats that tie up fishing lines, off of Miami and off of Brazil and that kind of thing, right? So it's really, there are these global effects. Did you want to say something, Kendall?
Yeah, sorry. Are you sharing your screen?
Yeah. Oh, how long have I been doing this? Yes. Yeah. I mean, no, I'm not sharing my screen.
I was gonna say, I didn't know if you were meaning to do that or not, so I didn't wanna.
Yeah, no, it's been this whole time. I just thought it was wrong on my end, so I didn't say anything.
Okay, here, now I will share.
You were like, look at this picture,
goodness.
and I'm like, man, I'm really missing out.
Oh boy, you're losing all the visuals. I've just been a talking head for, okay, so now I'm sharing a window. Let me go back just so, whoops, oh no, wrong direction here. All right, that's that. Okay, I'll post all this online as well, so you'll be able to kind of grab the notes from that. But right, this was human ecology. This was, you can see Kansas and Nebraska from space, right? This was, okay, yeah, the campfire, right? The results of the campfire, people's houses burned down, in the forest there. And right, that's right. There's Africa. Okay, sorry about that. I'm actually getting worse at the online presentations. I forgot to record one the other day. This is recording though, by the way. So you'll be able to catch all that, and I will post the slides later. Thank you for alerting me to that. Okay, so a single ecosystem is the Earth, right? Okay, good. Then technology, right? So technology, obviously, if we were just cavemen with rocks and sticks, at that point, we wouldn't be doing much damage to the environment, right? Before we heard of chlorofluorocarbons, nobody could really put a hole in the ozone layer. So we need to have technology to really alter the environment. And of course, there's plenty of positivity to that. So technology, again, in the very abstract, is this knowledge or skills you apply to alter the environment, right? That help you with tasks of survival in the environment. There is, I think it is still in the textbook that this is something of humans, and that's not actually entirely true, right? And that's actually a bias that has been in sociology for since at least the beginning, and really kind of stretches back into ancient philosophy. This idea that like humans are unique and special. And of course, there's a theological dimension there too, of saying like God created humans in His image, and therefore they are very special as compared to all the other animals. Of course, many of the if you're a freshman and you read that or a senior and you read that octopus book earlier this year, you realize that there's actually quite a similarity, and obviously we're all kind of descended from common ancestors with the animals, and that's all towards this point about technology as well. So just for me to say that this the human animal divide is not as bright a line as we used to assert that it was. In one of those things is that kind of doesn't set us apart from the animals is this application of technology. So you will sometimes read that really humans are the only ones with technology, the only tool makers who use tools to alter their environment. Clearly, that is not true. This is I can't remember if it's a raven or a crow, and he knows how to. He's kind of fashioned this hook-shaped wire thing, and he's getting bugs out of a log, right? And that's something that we observe in a number of different species. But of course, I don't know of any species that has used technology to really alter the Earth to the extent, certainly, that human beings have. So when we talk about environmental problems, especially at a larger scale, we're frequently talking about the combination of technology and population size. So really, population problems are environmental problems, or environmental problems are population problems. Again, when you have small-scale societies with very little technology, you don't have much of an environmental impact. The larger the society, the larger the population size, the larger the impact, and the farther along the technology is developed, the greater the impact. By the way, I should say this. This goes back, pretty far in human history. So we think about 1,000 years ago, the Hawaiians caused certain bird species to become extinct because they hunted the birds to make really awesome feather headdresses, that kind of thing. And what that's an indication of is that Hawaiian population size and technology advanced to the point that they could have a significant impact on the environment. If you'll recall, Professor Skinner's art lectures from freshman year, from fall, at some point he shows you, I think it's in the art, Bridging Cultures, Bridging Times lecture, he shows you the snake mounds and those other mounds that were built by Native American peoples in the Midwest. We're fairly certain now that society died out because the population got too large, and they over-farmed their farmland. Basically, the farmland was no longer able to support agriculture in the way that it had, so that population died out. So this is something that's been going on for much of the history of human civilizations, but clearly it has accelerated considerably. And we tend to, and you'll see this in, just kind of across environmental sociology and environmental studies, this equation, I equals PAT, which is to say that the environmental impact is equivalent to the size of the population, the affluence of the population, and the level of technology. So a rich, high-tech civilization with a large population is going to be most damaging to the environment. And normally I would have a discussion here. So what societies are having the biggest impact? Clearly, though, it's the biggest societies, and so if you look at American society, Chinese society, Indian society, they're having huge impacts. But also the level of affluence factors in there. So it's really Americans and Western Europeans who largely have the biggest impact on the environment if you measure it with things like carbon emissions, right? So per capita carbon emissions by Americans and total carbon emissions by Americans are, I think we're actually at, in terms of totals, I think we're at number 2 now because China has surpassed us there. But, again, you look at the lifestyle. Because of the level of affluence that we enjoy cool stuff like this. I don't know how well this shows up on your monitors right now, but this dude has a what is this even? This is some kind of a Ford, the diesel Ford truck that he's attached a fifth wheel to, and he hauls around a giant speedboat. And you can just see, look at this. These are 3, I think these are 50-gallon tanks. Maybe they're 100-gallon tanks of diesel fuel that he has on here. I mean, this dude has a huge environmental impact, right? And he's rich, he can afford it. Obviously, if you're poor, you can't afford nice big toys like that and the fuel to fill them up. Okay. What this all leads to, arguably, is the environmental deficit. Which is to say that we're digging a hole, literally, right? We're literally digging holes in the earth that we can't replace the resources that we take out of. So the quick way of putting this is that we look for short-term resource gains, but we make long-term environmental damages. And eventually we run out of certain resources. Potentially some things that we may not be able to recapture. There was an argument about helium. Sorry, it seems so helium. Remember, like helium, we would run out of helium because we're using so much helium. Apparently, that's not true. We can actually get helium back, but there are other resources that we cannot get back. So, like old growth redwood. If you go look at old homes in California from like the 19th, early 20th century. They're built largely out of redwood, which came out of these old growth forests. We cut down so much redwood though in the 19th and 20th century that essentially we're never going to be able to use that as a viable building material again. It takes too long to grow redwood trees. So that's that kind of a thing. This deficit, right, reflects social choices. Although, we should say, for those people who are cutting down the redwoods, I think some portion of them really, never really thought about, if we use this material, we're never going to get it back again, right? So it's a choice in a sense, but certainly. In a more environmentally aware society, these are kind of real choices. Choices between doing one thing versus another thing, or doing something and not doing something else. Right. So the choice to have kids, that is a choice that impacts the environment, right? And of course, those are socially conditioned choices, right? So people aren't just thinking, or maybe. I think a lot of people probably don't think at all about the environment when they have a child. They're just like, people have babies, right? We want, babies are awesome. Let's have a baby, and it'll continue our namesake and our family and whatever. The choice though, the thinking that, that baby is going to consume so much in their lifetime and create so many carbon emissions and diapers and who knows what else, garbage, that may not factor in to the decision. And so different societies make these choices differently with a different awareness of the environmental impact. And so, of course, we say a lot of those choices lead to unintended consequences, right? Nobody intended that by having a baby they would add to the carbon emissions in their society. That's about the last thing on a lot of people's minds. We say this stuff is potentially reversible, but I think we do have to say that only to some extent, right? This I don't know if this is a copper mine. I think this is a copper mine. That you're never putting that genie back in the bottle, right? You're never going to have the pristine environment that was once there, and you're not putting the copper back into the ground. Now, there are other things clearly that are reversible. So, like the Hudson River was extremely polluted when I was a kid. In the 70s and 80s, and over time we have reversed that damage through a lot, through making different choices, through making the choices to not allow as much effluent into the river and to not allow industry to operate in the same way on the Hudson. So, yes. Deficit. Okay. Also tied to, again, tied to our cultural values here, the kind of impact that we can have on the environment. We say that we operate on a logic of growth in our society. So we have really a set of values, even a set of norms about how to do things. As a value, one of those values is clearly this quest for material comfort. We want stuff. We want comfortable stuff. We want heated seats in the Range Rover, right? and all of that has an environmental impact. The heated seats in the Range Rover, Land Rover. What's the difference? I don't know. But that adds up to a little bit more carbon emission. The materials, require more production, et cetera, et cetera. So it does have an environmental impact. Part of this logic as well is that we're always in a state of progress. Things are always getting better. We're a hugely optimistic species, but certainly over the course of the last 200 or 300 years, I mean, things have gotten a lot better. A lot of people have come out of poverty. We've conquered a lot of diseases. Not COVID-19 yet, but a lot of diseases, and people live now. I don't think there was this weird nostalgia back when I was a kid for like frontier days. You don't see. So I was going to say, like, if you compare this to Little House on the Prairie, but you don't. That's not a reference that works for you. I don't know if there are references that work for you guys because for whatever reason, the last 20 years or so, we've been obsessed with like zombies and we've been obsessed with. Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? Megan says, "Oh, a good time dying of dysentery," right? That's really right the kind of life that was experienced not too long ago in our own society. Right? So if you look at the contemporary American home with its nicely sealed drywall, the fireplace that's really just there for show, for being used, once or twice a year. Clearly, hopefully not on this holiday because it's way too close to the fire, to the Christmas tree. Right, we would start a fire here. But these people are so comfortable compared to, again, not all that long ago when you live in a drafty log home and wood heat would be your only means of staying alive during the winter time. So again, that's a very long-winded way of saying, we have made progress and we have a great deal of faith in that progress, right? We constantly believe that things are going to get better because of science and technology. Right, because we've learned these different ways. I mean, we've learned how to efficiently get hot and cold running water to almost every American's home at this point. So, how could things not get? How could any of this possibly lead to? This is the second part of the argument, or the sort of the kicker here that's going to bite you in the back. That the logic of growth doesn't recognize that certain resources are finite. That having these, so this is an illustration, obviously, of Christmas morning, right? And so for many of us, Christian or secular Americans, right, this is like the big day of the year. Certainly in your childhood, right, you're waiting for all that stuff to come. But we don't really think. I start to think, as I get older, and I'm the one who's packing up all this wrapping paper at the end of Christmas morning. I'm like, man, that's a lot of garbage, right? That's a lot of, and that's gonna, I hope it's gonna get recycled, but I know probably a good deal of it's gonna end up in the landfill, and that's, this is the problem of finite resources, so we're cutting down trees, we're doing carbon emissions to make all of this happen, and we could be causing some problems that are really too complicated even to solve. So the question of carbon emissions is one. Another that frequently comes up is in terms of complexity is like we've built nuclear power plants, which are really pretty awesome in a way. I mean, you can get insane amount of relatively clean power to people by, you know, through the miracle of nuclear fission. The problem is that those, as we've seen, those plants are such complicated systems that when something goes wrong with them, as they have in the cases of Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, right? You know, that causes then these long-term environmental impacts that are basically irreparable. So, you know, in contradistinction to the logic of growth, we do have environmentalists now and others arguing that we need to limit our consumption. You know, limit our consumption, and of course limit that especially in terms of the growth of the population. So there have been for some time now, you know, people who believe in zero population growth. You know, and as you know from that last lecture, you know, population is still growing. The less the population grows, you know, the lower the economic impacts again. And also, you know, some people who are arguing that that we should limit the growth of the economy, that we really shouldn't just pursue material consumption and the production of goods at all costs. A different way of looking at this is called the treadmill of production. This is not part of your textbook, but if you're going on with any environmental sociology, you know, it is a common metaphor amongst those folks. I've been mentoring a independent study on environmental sociology this semester, so learning some of this myself. And this is really the kind of the common metaphor to understand, you know, the consumption patterned society, or the logic of growth society. And what a treadmill, I should note, you know, I think the treadmill they're thinking of is these human powered treadmills. So not the treadmill at the gym that's powered by a motor, but a treadmill that actually has to be powered by people walking on it. And the idea is that, you know, the treadmill demands constant impact or constant inputs. You got to keep walking on the treadmill for it to keep running. And the consequences, the conclusions that kind of lead us to is that capitalism, you know, constantly requires a growth in production. You know, so more people have to keep hopping on the treadmill to keep it going. We got to put more natural resources on the treadmill to get stuff to come out. That's these additional resources from the environment. We've got to keep people consuming those things, right? So the production treadmill assumes that people buy the stuff that gets produced, that's produced by them, right? And, you know, of course, along the way, that treadmill is also putting off pollution, right? You know, as we produce these goods, as we make consumer items, we pollute with carbon emissions, and, you know, heavy metals and effluent and whatever else comes off the treadmill along the way. And you can really see this, you know, currently with the state of the environment. I mean, kind of the weirdly, I don't know if it's ironic thing, is, you know, on a certain level, we're doing fine. You know, we've got enough food. I think now we have enough toilet paper, right? We've got enough to really survive pretty comfortably. You know, so there are a number of families who are struggling a bit with food security, but there is clearly enough food in the system to keep them fed, and so food banks are getting regular donations. You know, there's enough of all the basic needs in our society to keep going for quite some time. But because the treadmill has been interrupted, because people aren't going to their jobs in things like the tourist industry or bars and nightclubs, and because they're not, making non-essential goods, the economy is in a tailspin, right? And is going to take quite some time to recover. In another sense, though, we're also seeing right now that the environment, the natural environment, is arguably a lot healthier, right? So you can see pictures of like Los Angeles with no smog because 10% of the people or something, of what normally are or would be are driving to their jobs, right? So lots of people aren't driving to their jobs, and so there aren't those carbon emissions. We see different animals coming back to neighborhoods in various places because they're not afraid of humans. Humans aren't taking up the space anymore. So again, the treadmill is mostly paused right now, which is terrible for the economy, but arguably pretty good for the environment. There we go. So focusing then specifically on the problems, what's the crap that gets thrown off of the treadmill? Solid waste, clearly. If you've driven outside most of our major cities, you'll see these mountains of garbage. People say we're a disposable society because, excuse me. Well, because we do, we throw stuff out at an alarming rate. About 4.5 pounds of garbage a day, right? And that's things like your soda bottles, your candy wrappers, but even we also say we're in a throwaway society, because you get a new iPhone every, I don't know what, depends on who you are, I guess every year, 2 years, right? A lot of stuff isn't built to last. You just think of silly things like fans and stuff. Like a fan 50 years ago was built to last, right? Or a washing machine. Now they're very cheap. But it breaks, and it's like literally cheaper to buy a new one. Oh, printers. This is where it really kills me, right? Computer printers, right? It's almost always literally cheaper to buy a new printer than to get yours repaired if anything breaks, right? They're kind of built to break. Throw it out, right? And all of that adds up. Right. So again, to an average of about 4.5 pounds a day, they fill up landfills. Fortunately, landfill regulations in this country have drastically reduced the amount of ground pollution. But old dumps in America, and clearly this is a problem globally, the heavy metals, chemicals in our garbage, leach into the ground, potentially polluting the groundwater there. The part of the solution obviously is recycling, but it's not as pretty a picture as we'd like to think it is. So even in places where we are doing a lot of recycling, where consumers put a lot of their solid waste into the recycling stream, a good deal of that ends up in landfills anyway, either because it's too costly to clean or to recycle, or because there's simply no demand, right? So there's really not much demand these days, especially for recycled plastic. So a lot of that just does end up back in the landfill, even if you think you're recycling it. So ultimately, it is much better to reduce the amount of stuff you use, to reduce the amount of, say plastic bottles that you buy and so on. Water pollution. We are running out of water, and this is really kind of visible in certain places. In the southwestern United States, in California, they are starting to run up against deficits of potable water that you can drink. And that's an even greater problem in certain parts of the world, to the extent even that it is arguably part of the cause of armed conflicts. So in some place like South Sudan, where there is really not enough water to go around, that leads to really significant violent conflict. Also, though, obviously, we've polluted a lot of bodies of water, so that pollution can come into drinking water and affect the stream of potable water. Less a concern in the U.S. Now than it is globally. Still, places like this is India, or I was watching something of like people drinking out of Lake Victoria in Africa. People who depend on groundwater, are often getting pretty badly polluted water in a lot of parts of the world. Also, though, this pollution, and this is especially from groundwater runoff, and we see a lot of this in the United States, that groundwater runoff carries a lot of fertilizer with it. And that enriches the water to an unsustainable extent, so that causes algae blooms. We've seen a lot of this, around Florida over the last couple of years. I'm blanking on that. There's a town a bit south of here where a river comes out into the Gulf of Mexico, but it's become like solid with green goop over the last few years, and that ultimately leads to dead zones where fish and other marine wildlife cannot live because the algae sucks up all of the oxygen. And again, that's from fertilizer runoff. I think the worst example is probably where the Mississippi spills into the Gulf of Mexico. That creates a dead zone of huge proportions, varying proportions every year. Also, we've polluted the air, and this is not yet even talking about CO2, but just talking about particulates and other gases in the air that come from factory production, from cooking or heating your home, from transportation. Again, clearly that's a good deal of the pollution in American cities these days, and it's the fact that transportation pollution has gone away that has led to having a relatively cleaner air in those cities. Also, brush clearing and farming, that's really more of a developing world thing. But we know that a lot of again the bad air in cities in India are partly tied to farming practices there. Most of the developed nations have seen our air improve considerably over the last 50 years or so, and that's really tied largely to environmental regulations. But I remember in my own youth, in the 80s, when you used to drive into New York City in the summertime, it was pretty much always heavy with smog. It was just this kind of a brown cloud that hung around New York City. Nowadays, that still occasionally happens, but really much of the time, the last few times I've flown into New York in the summertime, it's been more or less perfectly clear. So this is a tractable, a solvable problem. But in developing nations, this is really not being solved. It is worsening, and of course, that's a problem for the natural environment. It's often a problem for human beings because this leads to all kinds of respiratory distress. Really, you're not supposed to go outside if the air looks like this. If you go to China on an exchange trip or something like that, and the air looks like this, try to stay inside. Try to stay somewhere where the air is being at least somewhat purified, because this is really not good for your lungs, and obviously it leads to premature deaths of people who have conditions like asthma or other pulmonary lung diseases. Acid rain, I bring it up only because the textbook mentions it, and I think you should know it's really more of a success story. Is acid rain in America? So there is some acid rain being cranked out because of Chinese plants at this point that have some impact downstream I guess it's downwind in Japan, and also because the Japan current, right? Some of those acid rain emissions actually make it to the U.S. and the Canadian West Coast. But again, when I was a boy, we used to watch film strip documentaries about acid rain and how it was killing the Adirondacks. So the Adirondacks are a mountain range in northern New York State. And the issue was that coal burning plants in the Midwest, so Cleveland, Buffalo, Chicago, whatever, included a lot of sulfur dioxide, and that sulfur dioxide, when it gets into rainwater, becomes, and I'm sure the chemists could help me out in terms of exactly what happens here, but it becomes essentially sulfuric acid. And so and now we got landscapers, sorry. So if you hear some background noise, we're trimming. What are we doing today? We're trimming the weeds around the oak trees. Okay. An environmental impact right there. Sorry. Acid rain. So, I'm not talking like it would burn your skin kind of acid, but it's more acidic than neutral. And it would do things like, so this was what a number of forests in the Adirondacks began to look like in the 70s and 80s, because the water was acidic, it made the ground more acidic. And so the trees died off. We talked a lot about dead lakes in those days, but it was kind of, I want to say it was kind of cool, actually, if you went to a dead lake, because it was perfectly clear, which is actually not good. What it means is that the water was too acidic to support animal life, to even support algal growth. And so the lakes would be completely clear, but of course that killed off fisheries and things like that. It was pretty bad. Really, though, the story in the United States is that is getting better. Those lakes in the Adirondacks are coming back. The trees are growing back in the Adirondack Park because we took public policy steps to stop acid rain. So this is that clean, beautiful coal that Trump talks about. Is like, yeah, you can't burn high sulfur coal in a lot of places in the United States now. And if you do burn coal, you have to have scrubbers on the smokestacks to pull most of the worst of the emissions out of the smoke before it enters into the environment. So, again, it's not really a serious environmental problem in the United States anymore, but I think it is a good indicator of how good public policy can restore the environment. Deforestation is a problem in a lot of the world. I should say, also though, it not a problem in the United States anymore. Right? We've reached a point now where there are, I read a couple of years back, there are more trees now in America than there have been at any time since the colonial era, because we embarked on kind of clear cutting of timber, both for farmland, but more for home building. And that really has slowed down considerably over the last century or so in the United States. Clearly, though, this is a huge problem globally, especially in the Amazon. Is one area people have been focusing on in the last year or so, because the Bolsonaro regime, the Brazilian regime, has opened up a lot more of the Amazon rainforests to things like agriculture, really. So partly people are cutting these trees down, for the wood themselves. Partly, though, it's in order to have access to the land to do things like cattle farming, and that's problematic for a number of reasons. Problematic because the loss of biodiversity. You're replacing whatever kinds of awesome creatures live in the rainforest with just grass and grass and cows, but also there's especially in this era of global warming, there's a big concern that having gotten rid of those trees were an important carbon sink. So those trees pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it into wood. But if you don't have those trees, you don't have that carbon sink anymore. And in fact, especially problematic is how they get rid of a lot of these trees is to burn them, chop them down, and burn it, and that is putting a lot of that carbon back into the atmosphere. And that leads us, then to the probably the greatest, or at least the environmental problem that is broadest in scope and probably most on our minds these days, and that is climate change. From anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. As you kind of know, there is some politics to this, but really there is a fairly broad consensus amongst scientists that yes, that carbon dioxide emissions are causing the Earth to warm up, and that human beings are the cause of those carbon dioxide emissions. So, from things really, since the Industrial Revolution, this has picked up. Obviously, anytime you burn a stick, have a campfire, that's creating some carbon dioxide emissions. But it's really since the Industrial Revolution, as we've been burning coal and other fossil fuels to power our industrial plants, that has caused a huge spike in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that has led to a warming atmosphere, which leads to a whole host of environmental problems. So those problems include things like stronger storms. We're clearly we're clearly seeing that, in terms of things like the flooding that Houston has experienced over the last few years, things like Superstorm Sandy, the greater hurricanes like Katrina that we are experiencing, the broader outbreaks of tornadoes that we experience now. These are all tied to global warming because the warmer atmosphere has more energy, can put more moisture in the atmosphere and really, wreak havoc upon us. Desertification, as certain regions like the Gobi Desert up here in China, or the Sahara, as those areas heat up, the grasses die off and the deserts get bigger, and obviously that leads to less arable land for people, less land that can be farmed. Also, those massive dust storms. Again, part of China's problem is that they're getting these dust storms of dust from the Gobi Desert. Again, the sargassum mats, the seaweed mats, we think are being caused by blowing dust from newly desertified land in Africa. It's very dystopian stuff here. Ocean acidification. Again, you marine biologists can probably explain this better than I can, but somehow carbon dioxide, when it precipitates out of the atmosphere, creates carbonic acid. If I'm getting this wrong, somebody please correct me. Creates carbonic acid, which then leads to the pH in the oceans to drop, which kills off coral. And when the coral dies, the fish die. And if the fish die, then the fishermen die. And it's horrible, right? So many. Sea levels are rising. Holy shit! Look, people. This is the median projection. Okay, this is the median projection of sea level rise from the the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. A bunch of real smart folks did projections, to try to figure out, well, if things keep getting warmer and things are melting, what's going to happen? Sage, what's going to happen?
I don't know, but I do have a question.
Yeah.
Typically, I think of the ocean as being very flat. Why do we see it rising at different rates in different spots? That doesn't make sense physically to me.
Yeah, so I'm not really good at that, but it has partly, I guess, to do with tidal patterns, right? So some areas are pulled more. Some areas it has to do with ocean currents. I know.
What was the question?
Why do some areas of the ocean rise more than others?
It has to do with the way the continents are actually presented. So as if you look at America, I guess you can't, if you have the cursor over on our side, on the Californian coast, it's a big rocky coast with an active, plate tectonics where the one plate is going under the other. So the coast isn't this gradual thing. If you go to our Florida beach, the parking lot and the beach are 1 meter difference in height, maybe. But in California, if you go to a coast, you look down at waves crashing into rocks behind you. And except for there are some beaches, but there are a lot of different elevations for that. So their coast isn't considered as developed as ours in terms of geologic time. So the gradient matters when sea level is rising eustatically, so over the globe, rather than just in one local region. So you get different heights for it in different places. And then there is different effects with tides as well. That's a part of it too. But a lot of it has to do with the gradients of the coastlines themselves.
So what's under the water matters.
Right, yeah. So if you're in California and you want to do beach replenishment, you can just dump a bunch of sand right off the coast and the sand will kind of stay there. But if you're in Florida, you actually have to dump, if you wanted to fully save our beaches, which we don't do, we do these little half measure things, you would have to go almost 4 miles out to get to a point where the waves don't disturb the bottom of the ocean anymore, where they take
Whoa.
sand away. So the gradient's like really, really different. So the way sea level rises is going to be dramatically different for our coast versus you know, the California coast. It's actually, if you like, there's like a map that they've projected where like if sea level rose to where it used to be, like all of the major waterfalls that exist in like sort of like the Bible Belt, there's like these small like waterfalls on like every cliff, and somebody plotted them all on a map, and it makes like a perfect line for where they think sea level used to be. So like, because that's where the water used to rise to, and then it stopped, and like that's all of Florida, but the line doesn't like really do anything in California because it's, you know, mountains and stuff. So
Right. Very
but
cool.
yeah,
All right. Thank
and
you.
you did good on the ocean acidification thing. You missed a few steps on the bicarbonate stuff, but yeah, it's the idea.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. And yes, all right. And right, the bottom line, it's getting higher, and some people are more screwed than others, right? So clearly here in Florida, we're talking about like in the neighborhood of half to 2/3 of a meter, kind of, right? So that's you know, a couple of feet. And like Stephen was saying, right, you know, here you go to the beach, it's pretty flat, so that we're talking, you know, lots of Eckerd going to be underwater. You know, we've, you know, and this is real now, right? This is, people are having to plan for this society where the ocean has risen up. We had a whole bunch of emergency management type people here early in the year. I haven't seen the report yet, but trying to figure out like what does a place like Eckerd do with 2 feet more water? Like, what areas of campus are going to be flooded and unusable, and how do we plan for that? What can we do? Clearly, it's expensive. It's a problem. And, you know, ultimately, we're talking in some parts of the world, like, you know, Southeast Asia here, or the Pacific Islands. We're talking about places where people are being completely displaced, right? People won't have homes anymore because their homes will be underwater. Louisiana has a lot of that already going on. So, global warming is a problem. Some efforts clearly are underway. You know, there are Kyoto protocols. Countries are trying to reduce their carbon emissions. Globally, carbon emissions really aren't going down yet, though. And there, any way you cut it, you know, we've already warmed the environment to the extent that we're not going to be able to avoid many of these effects. You know, I guess the question, you know, some people have is, you know, is it going to be an out and out catastrophe? Is it going to lead to the end of human civilization? I don't think so, but clearly it's going to cause a lot of problems for people. Other issues, you know, and largely this is tied to global warming. But the decline in biodiversity, a lot of, especially animal species, but you know, species of plants and other organisms as well, are going extinct, to the extent that people now say that we have begun the sixth major extinction event in the history of the world. So, you know, problems, though, again, you know, I talk about this as a sociologist from the perspective of, you know, what are really the problems for people? You know, I'm sad about walruses. Walruses are cool, but you know, a walrus doesn't do my taxes, and I don't eat walrus. So, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that, well, some people do eat walrus, so that impacts their food supplies. But more broadly, you know, the decline in fisheries and things, you know, really does impact how we feed the globe. It harms genetic diversity, you know, so especially we look to other species for models for medicine and things. As we lose that diversity, we lose one of our best tools for solving problems. You know, the world's beauty, clearly, you know, well, some people like a good walrus. The world becomes a less pleasant place for us to live in, to the extent that we lose these species and these natural lands. And of course, it's irreversible, right? We're not going to reverse engineer dodo birds or anything like that. The Jurassic Park scenario is not playing out anytime soon. Turning again, just briefly, I think to theory. How do we make sense of this stuff? What are the underlying patterns suggest about humans and our relation to the environment? Structural functionalism, again, is looking for the links between structures and what needs different sort of structures fulfill. Clearly the environment we can think of as sort of a structure that fulfills a variety of needs for us. And we relate that to sort of how technology influences the environment. The manifest and latent functions of how we deal with the environment. So the manifest function is sort of the thing you plan to do, it's really environmental problems that are kind of a good source of these latent functions, these unintended consequences that you didn't mean to do. So when we were, doing our carbon emissions, when we were building those plants, we just wanted to make washing machines and video games and stuff. We just wanted to make cool stuff. But it turns out there are all these latent functions to doing that as well that really harm the environment and ultimately harm human societies. Looking at culture, its structural functionalist perspective is almost a bit of a pessimistic perspective, or at least it gives us pause and makes us think that the changes that we need to make to stop harming the environment are going to be very difficult, because we have built this entire culture around consumption, around our own comfort, and we know that cultural change is slow. It's possible, but it's slow and it's difficult, and the culture guides our actions, right? And so to the extent that we remain people who like to drive large automobiles over long distances, that's problematic for the environment. And again, with the interconnection thing, so partly we like to drive these large automobiles because it's just fun, but partly it's because we've developed this whole system in our society of commuting to work, of having single family homes. I mean, one of the real, worst things for the environment that Americans have kind of invented is this suburban tract housing that many of us live in, where you've got what do you have, like a 1,500 to 3,000 square foot house that's just you and mom and dad and a sister or brother maybe. We like to take up a lot of space, and we want it to be pretty far away from where we work. And just on a basic level, that house takes a lot of energy to run. And then if you're far away from your work, you're probably going to have to hop in a car to get there. So these patterns, these really kind of, that we don't necessarily think about as being environmentally harmful. You don't hop in your car necessarily. I know some of us do these days. Hop in your car and think about, I'm killing some whales here. But that is, ultimately the outcome of our life patterns here. The suggestion that feedback can change system properties, I mean, that's, at a sort of a hopeful thing, but really the problem with this feedback is that it's not very visible to a lot of people. So, this would be, if you, if you put the wrong kind of fertilizer on your lawn and it turns yellow, you're like, whoa, I'll never do that again, because you get that kind of feedback, and all kind of, human beings and human systems, take that feedback and alter their behavior. This is really one of the problems of massive scale environmental change, like carbon emissions, is that the feedback from your own individual carbon emissions, or even from a firm's carbon emissions, don't become very real to it, because a fraction of a degree, you don't think when your house is flooding, you don't think to yourself, like, ah, man, I should have gone with the Prius instead of the F-150. That's just not how we tend to think. The sort of the optimistic side of that, the public policy side of that, is to say, well, maybe if we do things like charge firms for their carbon emissions, so things like carbon credits or cap and trade systems that actually provide some feedback to a firm about how much they're polluting, that might change their behavior. And that's really based on this kind of basic structural functionalist notion that when a system gets feedback, it responds to that feedback. And again, the problem is that environmental feedbacks tend to be at a pretty great remove from the system itself. Conflict theory. There's really been a lot of emphasis on this in recent years, and I think it's kind of especially come home to a lot of Americans since Flint, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, is that the people who pay the biggest price for environmental degradation are poor people, right? So the guys who own the firms that do the polluting, they live in fancy houses up on hills far away from the factories. It's the poor people who live in the places that actually experience the environmental degradation. So that's what we refer to as environmental racism, because often those people are also racial minorities. So this is an image from the 70s. I think it's Birmingham, Alabama, but you can see these the smoggy smoke emissions from a plant nearby that was burning batteries to recycle batteries, car batteries. So clearly, that's all kinds of heavy metal emissions and smoke. It's really unhealthy for folks, and that overwhelmingly, or at least disproportionately, affects racial minorities and the poor. Also, though, just kind of at a higher level of abstraction, Marx had identified this in the 1840s. He was identifying cases of environmental degradation that were tied directly to capitalism. And so this is really environmentalism is kind of part and parcel of Marxism from the beginning. Noting that capitalism pursues profits, it doesn't care about the environment, and it really does degrade the environment from the beginning. What is more, because the rich tend to fund the political apparatus, the politics are set up in such a way that it defends the polluters. It's really difficult to get environmental anti-pollution regulations passed, and once they're passed, it's quite difficult to get them enforced. And of course, that leads us to this, that there's clearly a divide between conservatives and liberals in this country about how to deal with the environment. Again, though, there's always some kind of crossovers with these political issues. So, there are conservative conservationists, people who like to hunt, who really want to see land conserved and are really anti-pollution, that kind of thing. And I'm sure there are liberals who are driving large SUVs. But to put it in very general, stereotypical terms, conservatives tend to be optimistic about the environment, believing that markets solve all problems. And so if environmental problems get bad enough, somebody will figure out a way, some capitalist will figure out a way, invent something to make the world a better place and make a bunch of money along the way. They point out, and this is kind of correct, I mean, that doomsayers have always predicted that the world is ended, bad things are happening, and that really is a characteristic of human civilization, which should give us some pause and say, like, well, yeah, I mean, it seems like science, but what other projections might there be? We don't know. But I should also point out that it's really only American conservatives, who form a significant block of people who actually deny climate change, and even that is showing some signs of breaking down now, especially when we see GOP governors in states like Florida, where we're really exposed to climate change. They're beginning to take things a bit more seriously than they have, because the effects are just getting to be too hard to ignore. Liberals, on the other hand, right, believe that governments should put limits on growth. Some argue that they embrace a neo-Malthusian perspective. So if you remember Malthus from the last lecture, he generally believed that the population was going to grow and hit a wall where we didn't have enough agricultural production and we'd all die. Or there'd be famines, there'd be wars, etc. There are some amongst liberals who sort of take that sort of a view of things, a very dark view of environmental problems, and really are worried that a large portion of our population will die off. And so liberal policies advocate, investing in clean energy and solar and wind, those kinds of things, and heavily regulating polluters, right? So making it very costly to pollute. And from a movement perspective, what's interesting, I think, here is that there have been different environmentalisms for different eras of our country and our world. And what is more, right, it presents us with one of the social movements that really has a pretty long history, so things like the LGBTQ movement or the civil rights movement, are relatively recent things. The environmental movement, goes back, at least to the late 19th, early 20th century, with Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir and other conservationists, setting aside land. So one of the real kind of great things America has done was to set aside parkland, because they were already recognizing that we were chopping down a lot of trees and building a lot of cities, and we want to preserve some of the natural beauty. And so that has been with us for a long time. It's really in the 1960s that we get modern environmentalism, the modern era of environmentalism, with Rachel Carson, who was who did she work for? Woods Hole, one of those organizations. Scientists who recognized that pesticides were really having a pretty incredible negative effect on the environment. And so she wrote that book, Silent Spring, basically about how, the birds weren't singing and the bugs weren't buzzing because we killed them all with DDT and other pesticides and chemicals. And that really, got a lot of people aware of the environment in a way that they hadn't been, and leads to eventually fisheries. Thank you. She worked for fisheries, and yeah, that and other that and there being a lot of hippies around and other things led to the establishment of the EPA in 1970. I think it's interesting. I should point out, that the EPA, which regulates industries, right, to against pollution, is not heralded, shepherded, is birthed in the Nixon administration, right? Nixon actually, the Republicans were in favor of this. It's a very different political landscape now than it was 50 years ago. And clearly now we have Republicans who are trying to back off of those regulations that the EPA created. So the current environmental movement, includes a variety of organizations, and again, drawing people from different parts of the political spectrum. Certainly plenty of Sierra Club members are more conservative folks, but who really want the preservation of lands and natural resources. Nature Conservancy, similarly is about buying up natural lands or restoring habitats. 350.org is Bill McKibben's organization that works against carbon emissions, the 350 being the point which we have passed of 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, beyond which we have a lot of environmental problems. Greenpeace tends to be a more radical organization, to eliminate various kinds of environmental harm and to defend the animals. And the ELF, the Earth Liberation Front, seem mostly to be waning these days, but they were a very radical, even sort of terroristic organization. They didn't target human beings, but they would do things like burn down housing developments that were under construction. So these are, I guess, what you would call radical environmentalists. Okay, so wrapping up, to survive, right? Again, as a species, because the Earth's going to survive regardless. The Earth doesn't care about you. The Earth probably doesn't like you after all the things you've done to her. She'll be fine. But to defend the human species and our relation to the environment, we would say we need to develop an ecologically sustainable culture. And of course, we hear a lot of this talk about sustainability, but really this means not running that environmental deficit, not polluting the air to the point where we won't be able to breathe it, or where it's going to melt the ice caps and drown us all. And clearly there is increased movement globally to face these environmental challenges and to develop that sustainable culture. And of course, what that depends on is things like conserving resources, wasting less stuff, right? Throwing fewer things out, reducing population growth ultimately will probably have the greatest impact on reducing emissions and reducing environmental problems, and developing the eco-centric as opposed to the egocentric culture, right? So this would be, rather than thinking about what makes me happy, what makes me feel good, if we could develop a culture, where people say, what decisions can I make that will be good for the environment? If we develop that kind of culture and promulgate that kind of culture, and the kind of public policy that encourages that kind of culture, then maybe we have hope. But again, there's a lot of doom and gloom out there. So that is going to have to be all for today. Recording of this will be up, and I'll try to remember to get the PDFs of those slides up sooner than later. And I forgot to mention midterms. So there's 2 midterm grades online. There's one that's with the test you actually took. That grade is wrong. I put something called like the adjusted midterm grade. That one is right, and it's much higher in, I think, all cases. Okay, I will see you on Thursday. Yes, Thursday will be the last lecture. So have a good one. I'll be signing off.
Thank you.
All right, see you guys.